Broadcasting from the business capital of the world, this is the Podcast Business News Network. And welcome back, everyone. Talking about something that impacts all of our lives or will at some point, and that is grief. Comes in many different shapes and forms, and there's a lot of misconception around grief, what it is, how to get through it. We're going to talk about that today. I do believe you're going to learn a lot, and this is not just for anybody that's going through it now. For anybody that wants to chart the future, it's going to happen at some point. Let's be honest. It's a part of life. Or maybe you're supporting somebody who is grieving. We're going to go to a professional for that. He is a grief coach. His practice is called The Good Grief Journey. Cam Taylor joins us once again here on the program. Hey, Cam, how you doing?
Doing well. Good to be here.
Yeah, it's good to have you here, especially since this is uncharted territory for lots of us. There's lots of myths that people have in their mind about grief, whether they're going through it, whether they want to support somebody else. Either way you look at it, it helps move your life forward when we learn some of these misconceptions. Not sure where do we begin on this one. Where should we do it?
Well, let me give you one of the big ones I hear that I run into, and that is people say that grief and mourning are the same thing. And I just want to pull those apart and distinguish the difference, because it's a very important distinction that once I discovered it, I thought that's exactly what I needed and what other people need. And this is defined by Alan Wolfelt, a person that I've really looked to for guidance in this area, but I've come to really own it for myself. Grief has been described by Alan, and I do the same thing, as the internal processing that goes on after a loss. So that's the emotion, that's our reactions and our bodies, and that's so vitally important. But if that's all that you have, I do not believe that you will grieve thoroughly and well. You need the other side, and that's mourning. So grief is internal. Mourning is the externalization of what's actually going on inside. It's having people that you're able to tell your story to. When you're doing that, you're mourning. It's having those rituals, having those celebrations of life, and having a graveside to go back to, or a place in the bush where you've actually placed those ashes and be able to share that with others. That's the mourning process. And we need, I believe, both of those. It's not enough to have your own journey internally. You need to get that outside of yourself and involve others on that journey.
Within the mourning process, is that the shorter, more immediate after a situation presents itself? And again, just to identify here, grieving, mourning can come in many different reasons for many different shapes of forms. It could be, of course, a loss of a loved one, but it could be loss of a relationship or a job. But mourning, is that more immediate?
I think it's yes, no, yes and no. I think mourning can be immediate. Like, for example, you lose a job and instantly you're maybe talking to somebody about that loss. So there's some mourning going on there. And often when your loved one dies, you have a service. Before and after COVID, we usually had services fairly soon. And there's mourning that happens fairly quickly. But the reality is that's just the tip of the iceberg, I believe. That mourning needs to kind of go on until it's gone on long enough. Like, you need to have people you can tell your stories to. I say months later. And there's no timeline on that. So I think grief and mourning both are something we need to travel with for some time. And it will vary depending on the person every time.
Now, you said a period of potentially months. Could somebody be mourning for years?
For sure. And I think that's the other observation I've made, and I've read a lot about this. There will be the stats vary, but around 15% of people who've had a significant loss will stay in a state of prolonged grief for a long period of time. Whereas they say 85% have the wherewithal, the resiliency to eventually go through the hardest parts of their grief and be able to make sense of life and move on with their life in some form or fashion. So some people, it can be months, others it is years, others it's years, and it's very similar to the day that the loss happened. And for those people, they need deeper help and do some deeper work for sure.
Lots to talk about here, and we're going to go deeper into the misconceptions of grief. But I want to just get a better lay of the land, if you will. We have grieving, we have mourning. Mourning seems that it can be more immediate, and I'm wondering if grieving goes longer than mourning, or could one be more than the other? Could they ride hand in hand with each other? Just trying to break those two words down.
Yeah, and I do think that oftentimes people just use the word grief or grieving, and it encapsulates some of the mourning aspects by the definitions that I'm using. So I think the thing that really has helped me is that, people ask, when does grief end? Will my grief ever end? And the answer that I've come up with is no, because grief is something that stays with us throughout our lives. Now, definitely it diminishes. There is a reduction in the intensity of it. But the way I look at it is, if we're grieving in a healthy way, and I'd also say mourning in a healthy way, we're including others, they know our story, we're traveling together. Our lives, when we're practicing resiliency and some of the things that I've talked about and written about, our life will actually enlarge. And I think that's a great visual and a direction that we want to go after we've had a loss, that eventually we want to be able to add new relationships, new experiences, new ways of thinking and being, new purpose, new identity. And as your life grows, that grief, which used to be your whole life when it happens, that loss, actually stays as a part of your life. But because your life is enlarging, then the grief has less of a hold on your life. That's one way that's really been helpful for me to think about that.
Sure. And even when we say that doesn't mean that you don't care, miss, or love that person any less. Just want to state that, because I think there's a lot of guilt that comes into play there, where, well, I didn't think about them today, or I'm having fun kayaking with a bunch of friends, but I always used to kayak with my loved one who's no longer here. Does that mean I don't feel the same way about them? And no, that has nothing to do with it, right?
No, exactly. And I remember distinctly a day that happened for me, this whole idea of maybe thinking of them a little bit less, but not thinking less of them. And I was out bike riding, and my wife Vicky and I used to ride a tandem bike, so we'd go everywhere on it. We did long road trips, and we had wonderful experiences on this tandem bike. And it had been a few weeks after she had passed away, and I'd been gifted a nice gravel bike by her work, and I was enjoying that, and I was traveling out in the middle of the country by my house, and I had this thought that hit me. I don't miss my wife right now. Now, with that came this wave of guilt. I can't feel that way. But then as I process this, I think, what is that? Why am I thinking that? I'm thinking that because I've sort of come to terms to the fact that she is not coming back. And that's a part of what you need to go through. You have to get to the point where you no longer have to have them back in your life. You've been able to let them go. And that, for me, was a bit of that was a line, not a bad line, but it was a shift that happened. Now it's a relationship of memory. It's no longer a relationship of having her presence with me. And I could ride my bike, think of her, think of the places we would go, but I was actually feeling alive and enjoying this exercise and nature and this activity that her and I loved, definitely, but I didn't miss her the same as I did just a short few days before that.
Going to go a little bit deeper here and expound upon what you just said. And we're going to get back to the misconceptions of grief in just a moment. But did you have this feeling, Cam, of I'm biking, she's not with me. You had that moment of guilt, but did you reframe it, or have you reframed it, or should we reframe it by thinking, wow, this person instilled in me this biking thing, and I love them for that. They're not here. It's a different time and situation, but I have a love for them just in that alone, that I can continue doing this, but I realized my love there. That's one question. And then I guess part two of that is, do you ever think, or should we think, that that person is just not here? They're still around, maybe someplace else, but they're just not here right now. Is that healthy? So kind of a two-part question there.
Yeah, I think it is. And when I think about the love that I have, and I say have present tense, for my first wife. Now I've remarried, 4 years later. I have love for my current wife, but that does not change or diminish the love that I feel and have for my first wife. So I think it's the ability, though, to hold both of those without it seeming kind of odd or is something off. No, you can have lost something and have love for that person and then have love for somebody else. I think the other reality is that I always looked for ways to carry the memories that we had with us. And one thing I did, as soon as I got this new bike, I put a decal on the front bar of that bike, and it's in the handwriting of my wife. So my bike is named Vicky. And when I'm riding, I'll think of that. I've sent pictures to her family, those that knew her, and I'm out here on this new bike and I'm remembering Vicky and all the good times we had. And I still will have memories of our times together. And that doesn't diminish the life I have now or make that any less significant. I feel like I can hold both. I can hold that memory, that love, and hold my life now with incredible amount of joy and anticipation at the same time. Beautiful. And that's, I think, a gift.
Beautiful.
Yeah.
Yeah. Again, she's with you,
That's right.
In a different way.
Yeah.
Back to the misconceptions. I've always heard that there are 5 stages of grief and we have to go through all of them and blah, 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 blah. Misconception?
Definitely. Yeah. The misconception that grief has a linear pathway that everybody follows. And definitely the framework or the pathway that is quoted often is the Kubler-Ross 5 stages of grief. And one thing that I found very interesting, I've done some reading on the founding, where that came from originally. Originally, it was for those who actually were dying, and it was describing their stages before death. But even in the future use of those phrases, Kubler-Ross never intended for that to be linear. And so I appreciated hearing that, because it wasn't so much what she did, it's what we did with those stages. We tried to make it easy. And I think that's what happens sometimes. We humans, we like formulas. We like certainty. We like to know that when this happens, then this happens. And grief is way messier than that. Now, it's not to say that you won't experience anger, blame, denial, all those things with loss. And definitely you get to a place of, okay, I've accepted it. So it's not that those are wrong, but those aren't normative for everybody. I would say I had very little anger after my wife died. So did I miss that stage? Was something wrong with me because I didn't go through that? No, it's because we have to enlarge the categories, enlarge the language that happens when people go through loss and experience grief. It's much more diverse. And I wrote a little article, 50 ways to grieve your losses. There's not 5, and there's more than 50, but there's physical reactions. There's what happens in our emotions. Our mind has all kinds of reactions, and I could just list them off, which I won't. But the misconception is it's all nice and tidy and neat and orderly and just follow the stages through and you'll be on your way. That is not true.
In one way, it's good to hear the stages, just get a baseline, but then bad in another way, because somebody could say to themselves, I'm not feeling anger, but that's one of the 5 stages. Well, maybe I'm not grieving right. Maybe I don't love them as much as I should, and all of that. It opens up the proverbial can of worms in somebody's mind. So good in a way, not so good in another. Yeah. Always heard this: you should move away from grief and not toward it. Misconception?
Yeah, I believe so. I think if people say to you, especially people that are themselves uncomfortable with the hardness, the difficulty that's with grief, they will say, you should be moving away from that. Don't you want to get on with your life? And people try to, they come with an agenda for grieving people because they want them to feel good again, or they want them to let that job that you lost go and go find another job, or whatever it is. And I think that the only way to grieve well is to go through it.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I think that's the only way, because it's this whole idea. And there's lots of studies that prove if you have to go down into it before you can come out the other side. And some people will say, well, I don't want to start crying, for example, because what if I can never stop? Well, that has never happened.
Yeah.
You will actually find relief. Let's just talk about tears for a minute. It's actually built into us at birth as a way, as a mechanism to bring healing, to heal the toxins that are in our body. So when you're grieving and you're feeling sad and you're about to break out in tears, let them happen. Don't move away from that, because that's the very emotion, the very feeling that you need to go down into. And guess what? There is going to be a bottom there that you'll actually start walking up the other side of that dark valley. And it happens in stages, and it's not neat and tidy, but I do believe going through it is definitely the way to get to the other side, not avoiding it.
And don't be afraid of your tears. It could be 20 years later and you get teary for whatever reason it might be, but that's all normal, right?
Exactly. Yeah. Welcome tears. Welcome tears. I love the saying. I heard this somewhere, and I use this throughout my life when I've had different challenges. I had a very serious motorcycle accident. I learned a lot about loss and a lot about tears, a lot about pain. And somebody said to me something I read: don't hand the Kleenex box to the person too quickly. Ooh, that's good. That's good. Let those tears flow. Let that grief come out. Don't stop it. Don't try to shut it down before it's time.
What about self-care and showing yourself some compassion as you grieve? I believe there's probably some guilt that comes into play that keeps us away from doing those things that could make us feel better.
Yeah, self-care is a huge area, and there's a lot of things that you could fit into that category. One thing that it may seem like it doesn't fit, but I really believe it does. I think we have to avoid comparison as a way of self-care. And that's where we look around and we see somebody else's grief and we think, oh, why am I not grieving like them? Or you could even compare your loss to somebody else. And that doesn't really help. What helps is, this is my reality. Compare yourself to yourself. Like, look at where you've been yesterday and where are you today? That's a lot more helpful. And I think that's a form of self-compassion and self-care. Another one is that I really took this to heart, and I'm not sure I didn't hear it this way until after the fact, but we need to learn to dose our grief. Take our grief in smaller doses. Don't just allow ourselves to be overwhelmed without trying to take breaks. I'll give you an example of this.
Please, because I'm trying to figure that out, how you can govern or regulate your grief.
Yeah. So in that, I would say find distractions that are healthy, that don't actually last too long. So, for example, my wife, Vicky, we had set up hospice at home. So she was in the bedroom just down the hall in our hospital bed, and definitely on a lot of medications to ease the pain. And my daughter was living in the house with me and my wife. So we would go out into the family room, and we literally watched all 26 of the Marvel movies in a row. Now, not at the same time though. So you see, that for us was an example of we were dousing, not dousing, that's the wrong word. We were dosing. Don't douse your grief. Take it in smaller pieces. So we'd go and watch 45 minutes of this movie, go into another world, and then we'd turn it off and we'd go and care for my wife. And I think that's also true after she died as well. That don't just think you have to be in it all the time. Allow yourself a chance to take a breath. Turn on watch some comedy, as hard as that might be. Find a way, go out and walk around the block, or do something that's fun, even though it may not feel like it. And that's another type of self-care that's so totally important. One other quick one or brief one is this. Sure. Don't forget to look after those basic needs that you have. Go to bed at a regular time. Even if you can't sleep, get into some kind of a rhythm. Eat healthy meals. Go for walks. Get some exercise. And sometimes it's so hard to do that, especially in the early stages, where you just want to lock yourself in the room and be in the dark. But practicing those daily practices are so important because it gets you into some routines that you can carry with you and that will help to move you along. Connect with other people. And, go for coffee, go for walks, find people, don't isolate yourself. That's self-care. That's looking after yourself when you're grieving.
Such great advice. We're just about out of time. I know there's more that we wanted to get to today, so perhaps we could jump back to that next time.
That sounds good.
Yeah. But thank you for breaking a lot of these things down with the misconceptions, because, till we met, I would hear the 5 stages, for example, and think that is the formula. That's the roadmap, the GPS to go through grieving, but maybe not so much. And definitely not in equal installments of those, 5 different stages. Cam, what's the best way to connect with you?
Best way is to go to my website, goodgriefjourney.com. And I've got different free resources. I also have my new book, Unlocking the Mystery of Grief. A lot of what I'm talking about is really nicely laid out in short chapters where you can read about this stuff and just learn and actually journal some of the things that you're learning. So go to that website and connect with me. You want to reach out, I've got a way for you to do that as well. And I look forward to staying in touch.
Oh, I look forward next time we get together. Thanks so much for today.
Okay, thank you.
Appreciate it. We'll be right back. Broadcasting from the business capital of the world, this is the Podcast Business News Network.
Let's go inside the mind of a 10-year-old.
I should have worn those earrings today. I like those earrings. Gabby has those awesome earrings. I need to ask her where she got those, but that's just what she would want me to do. I'll have Michaela ask her for me.
Buckle up, Sarah.
Yeah, but then Michaela will be like, why don't you just ask her yourself? That's just like Michaela.
Sarah, buckle up.
Michaela's such a great name. I wish I was called Michaela. There's like a dozen Sarahs in my class.
Hey, we're not hitting the road until you buckle up, honey.
Oh yeah, seatbelt. I forget sometimes because my brain is like busy, I wonder if there's pizza at school today.
Sometimes it can be tough to get through to your kids, but it's not impossible. Always make sure they're wearing their seatbelts, even on short drives. Remember, you have the keys, you have the power. Never give up until they buckle up. A message from the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration and the Ad Council. Visit safercar.gov/kidsbuckleup for more information.